Jeff Damon Younger is a worm of a man who has gleefully endangered the life of his own daughter, Luna, for his own personal gain. He's someone that the people of Texas have ruled unfit as a father in the court of law, yet rather than accept any sort of responsibility for his actions, Mr. Younger has set out to mislead the public and has even started running for office in Texas House District 63, Denton County. Now, you can rest assured that we will get around to precisely how Mr. Younger has chosen to endanger the lives of his own children in the next video. But before all that, I feel we need to tackle the main lie he's been peddling the past several years, and that's the idea that his former wife has been coercing his daughter into thinking that she's transgender. Not only is his justification for endangering his daughter's life reliant on said lie, but spoiler, said assertion is built on a foundation of sand that crumbles away under the lightest pressure. Though before we can delve into all that, I just need to give a content warning for the following topics: transphobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, dead naming, domestic abuse, child torture, child endangerment, Christian theocracy, gun violence, and police violence. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. So, if you're like me and are someone who has heard about Damon Younger, you've likely heard the same twisted narrative I did. It's the story of a young boy that dresses and acts like a boy at their dad's house and doesn't show any signs of gender dysphoria around him or indeed any of the family friends. Meanwhile, the boy's mother is forcing him to identify as a girl, something she does with the assistance of a pro-trans therapist who is given a false diagnosis of gender dysphoria and is subsequently pushing the child closer to medical sterilization. This is a story as was broken by famous anti-trans voice Walt Heyer, writing for The Federalist in 2019. It's the story that went on to be echoed by countless conservative and fundamentalist Christian blogs such as the Daily Wire, Breitbart, the Christian Post, the Christian Examiner, Russia Today, World News Group, and the New American, to list a few. No credible news source would even touch the story, and the reason behind that was pretty simple. The original Federalist article, upon which all subsequent articles were based, relied solely on the unverified assertions of the child's father, Jeff Younger. The very same assertions that Jeff Younger presented in court on the 10th of July 2018, stating that, quote, "Well, I think that one of the things that I think came out in Rebecca Ower's testimony, who I think is a person of very high integrity, by the way, and I really respect her, she said it was both true, that Luna is comfortable in boys' clothes, and Luna says that she is anxious when her father asks her to dress as a boy. And the reason for that is, Luna markedly changes her answer when she is with me versus when she is with her mother." End quote. Mr. Younger would also go on to add that, quote, "I don't think it's good for my daughter, actually, to affirm that she's something that she's not. And I still think it's up for grabs whether she actually is transgender because we haven't had an independent psychological evaluation." End quote. This was a narrative parroted by Mr. Younger's lawyer, Logan O'Donnell, who would give the most direct mistelling of events during his opening statement. Quote, "The mother has refused, very aggressively, to have any other input from any other experts. She will not allow a second opinion. Under the prior order that she seeks to modify, she has the exclusive right to medical and psychological and psychiatric treatments, and she is using that to full effect, very carefully picking people who say what she wants to say." End quote. Sadly for Luna and everyone else involved, Mr. Younger has not moved on in spite of losing in court repeatedly, as can be seen in this clip I'm about to play you, taken from a stream he appeared in back in August of 2021. Just a quick note, James is Luna's dead name, which I've changed in all the materials I can out of respect for the child's autonomy, yet sadly I couldn't do so with the clips involving Mr. Younger himself.
I have been complaining for the last year and a half that the Dr. Susan Fletcher, who's my son's counselor, court-appointed counselor, I've been complaining that she only sees James when he comes from his mother's home. And she makes a big point to put him in dress and high heels and everything when he goes. And I said, it's clinically significant that he presents as a boy with me, and you're just not seeing that. It's been a year and a half.
So not a whole lot has changed in the last 3 years, only the name of the counsellor/therapist Luna is seeing, changing from Rebecca Ower to Dr. Susan Fletcher. Which I guess makes this as good a point as any to note the fact that, as of the time I am making this video, Luna has undergone no fewer than 4 independent assessments carried out by psychologists, psychiatrists, and counsellors, all of whom agree that Luna is trans and that it is her choice and hers alone to present as a girl. Because not only do we have Luna's mother, Dr. Anne Georgelas, a paediatric doctor who was the first to notice the possibility that Luna was trans, but she immediately sought out a second opinion in an unnamed child psychiatrist who worked at the same clinic she did. Said child psychiatrist reached the conclusion that Luna was trans after prolonged assessment. However, at Mr. Younger's request, Dr. Georgelas sought out the opinion of a third child specialist, this time someone she didn't know, by the name of Dr. Jennifer Pape. It's worth noting the fact that Dr. Georgelas already had full medical custody of Luna by this point and was thus under no obligation to do so. And it seems that Mr. Younger was ecstatic about the change. Not only was this a second opinion by an independent professional in child psychology, but she was married to a Christian pastor as well. Things were about as perfect as Mr. Younger could have hoped for when it came to his request for a second opinion being accommodated. Hang on a second, what was it Mr. Younger's lawyer had told the court in his opening statement? That, quote, the mother has refused very aggressively to have any other input from any other experts. She will not allow a second opinion, end quote. Funny, I could have sworn that what I just described was the exact opposite. It's also worth noting that whilst Mr. Younger and his lawyer both claim that Dr. Gugals is, quote, very carefully picking people who say what she wants to say, end quote, it was Mr. Younger who emailed Dr. Pape before she'd even had a chance to meet Luna, seemingly to try and influence her opinion away from a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Things really couldn't have been any more perfect for Mr. Younger. Or at least that's how he perceived things before Dr. Pape reached the very same conclusion as Luna's previous psychiatrist, leading Dr. Pape to refer Luna to Dallas's Children's Medical Center's Genesis Clinic. Said clinic is headed by child psychiatrist Dr. Meredith Chapman, who after looking over Luna's case, tried to reach out to Mr. Younger to ensure that he was involved in her transition every step of the way, something that would have greatly helped Luna's well-being. Mr. Younger refused to engage at this point, with his only email to Dr. Chapman stating that he was compiling evidence to present to her. He never followed up. Meanwhile, Dr. Chapman referred Luna to Rebecca Ower, an independent child counsellor, for assessment to see whether Luna would likely benefit from further support at the Genesis Clinic, making this Luna's 3rd official assessment. Part of the reason clinics like Genesis refer patients to independent therapists is to avoid a conflict of interest. Since Mrs. Ower doesn't work at the Children's Medical Center in Dallas, she has nothing to gain in writing a letter of recommendation, which she ultimately did, stating that Luna is trans and would likely benefit from Genesis assessment at an older age to see whether fully reversible puberty blockers would be beneficial in her case. As you might expect by this point, Mr. Younger was not happy about this and began sending letters to Dr. Pape, attacking Mrs. Ower, telling the doctor that, quote, Ms. Georgelas has enrolled Luna with a new counsellor, Rebecca Ower. She's a lesbian married to another woman. Luna's new counsellor is deeply involved in the transgender movement. Ms. Ower seems to favour various therapy with irrevocable consequences, such as hormone therapy for pre-adolescents. End quote. Reminder, this is the very same Rebecca Ower that Mr. Younger stated under oath that he viewed as a, quote, person of very high integrity, end quote, and that he, quote, really respects her, end quote. And whilst he acted as if he changed his mind over time when probed about this very issue in court, it's important to note that when he failed to get his way over the following year and went to Walt Higher, he once again threw Mrs. Ower under the bus as the flag-waving SJW therapist that was helping his wife indoctrinate and sterilize Luna. So clearly, Mr. Younger is nothing but an opportunistic liar who perjured himself, bearing false witness after having been sworn in on the Bible. I guess he saw it as a good opportunity to practice for any potential political career. But wait a second, the clip I showed at the start talked about a court-assigned counsellor, Dr. Susan Fletcher. Where does she fit into all this? Well, following further hearings, Luna was ultimately assigned a court-ordered therapist, Dr. Susan Fletcher, making this Luna's 4th official assessment. And, as you might have guessed from the way Mr. Younger talks about her, Dr. Susan Fletcher agreed that Luna is trans. So it's clearly not a case of, quote, the mother has refused very aggressively to have any other input from any other expert. She will not allow a second opinion, end quote. Rather, it's the case that Mr. Younger simply refuses to acknowledge any conclusion outside of the one he wants. He doesn't care about the 4 to 5 times professionals have told him that Luna is trans. He'll keep demanding that she sees more therapists so that he has a chance to convince them that he's right. And I say 4 to 5 since, again, Luna's mother is also a trained pediatrician. Now, I normally wouldn't include a parent in this equation, and 4 independent specialists is more than enough to confirm that the person in denial here is Mr. Younger. However, that would be very naive of me to do here. Why? Well, because of the way Mr. Younger has cultivated the narrative surrounding his daughter. Mr. Younger has done what men have been doing since divorce became commonplace. They've attacked the mental stability of their former partners as a means of claiming custody. It's a method reliant on systemic misogyny, which casts women as more emotionally unstable and thus prone to mental illness, something that has no merit in reality, but is sadly the view many people still hold, even to this day. It's why the word hysteria, a term referring to uncontrollable emotions, shares a common root with hysterectomy, both coming from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Indeed, hysteria became a clinical diagnosis forced upon women, first as a physiological disorder in the 19th century, and then later a psychological one in the 20th century. Women's emotions have been disproportionately pathologized throughout history, leading to a long and sordid history of medical violence, which is the very same violence that Mr. Younger and his supporters are tapping into in order to paint Dr. Georgelus as irrational. There are 2 general claims thrown around by Mr. Younger and his supporters for why Dr. Georgelus apparently feels the need to force Luna to be a girl. The first is her apparent emotional need for a daughter, and the second is Munchausen's by proxy. Relating to the first claim, that Dr. Georgelus is forcing Luna to be a girl out of some emotional longing for a daughter. What Mr. Younger and his supporters conveniently leave out when making this accusation is the fact that Dr. Georgelus already has 2 daughters. In fact, out of 4 children, the only boy in the group is Jude, Luna's twin brother who, as we'll see later, accepts Luna as a girl. Sadly for Dr. Georgelus, reality rarely gets in the way of conspiratorial thinking. People are lied to all their life, told that women are more emotionally driven than men, meaning that when people like Mr. Younger try to weaponize that misogyny, they're already primed to accept it without question. Moving on to the claim of Munchausen's by proxy, said term refers to a psychological condition in which a guardian exaggerates, invents, or induces physical or psychological symptoms in someone under their care, such as a child, in order to experience the attention they receive vicariously. What this ignores, however, is the fact that Dr. Georgelus works with and around trained psychiatrists 24/7. Hell, she very likely has to undergo mandatory assessments periodically to ensure that she is of sound mind due to her position of care. And yet, not one of these people has corroborated any such claim. Again, this idea, the notion of the mentally unhinged mother who is a danger to her own children, is a common argument among divorce cases, relying on cultural misogyny. Sadly, this specific instance has been promoted primarily on the name of a single person, Dr. Michelle Cretella, a former physician who is no longer certified. Why? Well, because she failed to keep up to date with advancements in her relevant field. She's been acting as Jeff Younger's expert throughout this entire ordeal. She's also a well-known proponent of pseudoscience, having gone so far as to become the executive director of the American College of Pediatricians, a collection of around 500 medical quacks. If the name sounds familiar, it's because said pseudoscientific institution chose it to leech off the credibility held by the American Academy of Pediatrics, an actual scientific institution with over 67,000 members. The American College of Pediatricians is to pediatrics what the Institute for Creation Research is to biology, geology, and cosmology. It's a collective of people who couldn't support their beliefs under any scientific scrutiny, so ran off and created a fake institution, dressing it up with official-sounding terminology to pretend like they're not disgraced members of their fields. Dr. Cretella also lacks a degree in psychology, meaning her opinion of Dr. Georgelus, or trans people for that matter, is as baseless as your average Joe. What's more is, even if she did in fact have such a degree, she'd now be facing an ethics inquiry since armchair diagnoses are a direct violation of medical ethics in the US, particularly in cases like these. Dr. Georgelus is a respected member of the pediatric community, she's surrounded by people trained to recognize Munchausen by proxy, she's been placed under national scrutiny, and yet there is no evidence to back up any of Mr. Younger's claims about his ex-wife. He is simply relying on misogyny to do the heavy lifting here, and that's a narrative the far right is all too happy to amplify. And the reason I feel so strongly about the need to counter this narrative is not just the fact that it is monstrous and prolific, but how, in this particular instance, Dr. Georgelus doing the right thing is what opened her up to all the abuse she has received over the past several years. Everything I am covering in this video has either come from documents Mr. Younger himself has made public, or articles tracking the case after he initially kicked up a stink. To date, Dr. Georgelus has refused to go to the media to try and have her side of the story heard. Why? Well, because it's what's best for Luna. Dr. Georgelus is doing everything she can to give Luna the most normal life she can have as a trans girl, a big part of which is preserving her privacy. She also fought to include Mr. Younger at this point, refusing to lower herself to his level and enter a mudslinging match in the papers. Because her number one job, not as a doctor, but as a mother, is to protect her baby girl. I can't even begin to fathom the strength Dr. Georgelus must have for her to constantly be bombarded with stones and not say a single thing against those who would exploit her child. I find it ironic that Mr. Younger considers himself a Christian man, seeing as how his former wife has shown such restraint in the face of all his bullshit, that she's perhaps one of the most Christ-like figures I've ever heard of. And to be clear here, I mean the filed-down Sunday school turn-the-other-cheek Christ that Christians like to present him as, not the actual biblical character who says some pretty heinous shit. However, we're not quite done. For you see, we've only cleared Dr. Georgelus of any accusations of a false diagnosis. What we haven't actually done is consider the possibility that she may still be forcing Luna to act in a certain way. Thankfully, the court transcripts provided by Mr. Younger can shed a little light on that. The following comes from a cross-examination of Misogyny by Dr. Georgelus's lawyer, Kim Meaders.
And when? Do you agree with Miss Jackson that these are Luna's choices to dress as a girl and have the name Luna?
Yes.
Is there any doubt in your mind that Luna identifies as a girl?
No.
Do you have any reason to believe the mother is in any way forcing this?
No.
Are Dr. Pape's findings, the pediatrician, consistent with your findings?
Yes.
Have you had a situation where Luna said she was anxious about any event coming up?
Yeah, in our most recent conversation.
And what was the issue?
There was a soccer game happening the next day and she did not want to go if Dad was going to take her because she didn't want Dad to make the coach call her James and dress in boys' clothes.
So, what did you recommend to her?
So, I didn't recommend anything to her. I just asked her, like, if you had a choice between going and not going, like, if you had a choice between not going at all or going and Dad taking you, which would you choose? And she said, I would rather not go at all. And I said, is it okay with you? I asked the question, is it okay with you if I tell Mum since Mum is not in the room? And she said, yes, you can tell Mum this. Reminder that this is the very same Misogyny that Mr. Younger would shortly go on to claim he had complete respect for. Fact is, it continues to get worse for Mr. Younger, since Ms. Zoa is not alone in what she reports. You see, the Ms. Jackson mentioned at the start of that section is Ms. Jasmine Jackson, an investigator for Child Protective Services. Now, we'll get to how they became involved in the first place in a minute, as it's a truly harrowing tale that displays the lengths of depravity and violence that Mr. Younger will stoop to, but first, let's address the CPS report's findings. Following CPS becoming involved, they conducted a series of interviews with teachers at Luna's school, Luna's twin brother Jude, and Luna herself, all done without either parent around, meaning that neither Mr. Younger nor Dr. Georgelus could influence the children with their presence. The teacher interviewed was Morgan Kimbrell, with the CPS report stating that
Miss Kimbrell stated she's never had any concerns of abuse or neglect for Luna. She states she's a very smart student and prefers to be called Luna. Miss Kimbrell states she's never felt that the student is pressured to assume the identity as a female.
They also interviewed the school principal, Angie Hooks, who expressed a similar sentiment, with the report stating,
She states she has also never had any concerns of gender identity for Luna. Miss Hooks also has no concerns of either child being pressured gender-wise to be one way or the other.
Moving on, we have Luna's twin brother Jude, with a report stating,
Jude states that Luna has always wanted to be a girl, and his mum lets her, but doesn't make her. Jude states his dad tries to make Luna be a boy by making her dress in boys' clothes. Jude states this makes Luna feel sad. Jude states he likes to play with dad.
Lastly, we have Luna herself, with a report informing us that
Luna states her mum has never made her dress in girls' clothes. She just wants to. She states her mum just wants her to be happy and safe. Luna states she also asks her mum to paint her nails for her. Luna states she prefers to be identified as a girl because that's what she likes. She states no one is making her.
Indeed, as Miss Jackson was cross-examined by Ms. Meaders, we got the following conclusions.
With regard to your investigation, did you find any evidence whatsoever that the mum was somehow forcing Luna to dress in girls' clothes?
I did not.
Did you find evidence that the dad is forcing Luna to wear boys' clothes?
I did. Fact is, Mr. Younger openly admits to lying to Child Protective Services when they began investigating him, telling them that how she dressed was entirely her choice, as shown during this cross-examination.
Do you have girls' clothing at your house?
No.
So if Luna makes that choice, she can't even fulfill it there.
That is correct. We don't allow it at my house.
Isn't it true that you told CPS that if it was Luna's choice, you would let her wear girls' clothing?
Yes. A fact he was dragged out on in court.
After that CPS report, where you said you would let Luna dress as a girl and wear girls' clothes if it was her choice, didn't you send Anne an email about soccer saying there's no way you would ever take her as a girl and she would go as a boy in boys' clothes?
I don't recall using that language at all.
James will go as James and not a make-believe girl?
Yes, I did say that. That isn't what you said. So Mr. Younger very clearly knows he's in the wrong and is lying to cover his ass after his entire scheme backfired. What do I mean by backfired? Oh, only the fact that it wasn't Dr. Georgelus who called CPS, it was Mr. Younger and his immediate circle. It all started with an open evening at Luna's school on the 8th of March 2018. Now, originally Mr. Younger was meant to have both Luna and Jude that night, however, the children begged their mother to take them instead, as they'd done previously with other nights. As seen in Mr. Younger's email, he had a history of forcing his daughter to dress up as a boy and dead-naming her whenever he took her to events, a fear that was later confirmed to be warranted by the statement Mr. Younger gave to the police. The children did not want that, especially at a new school in which Luna had always presented as Luna. So Dr. Georgelus offered Mr. Younger his choice of a different night to take them, as well as telling him that he could pick them up after the event had ended, giving him additional time with his children to make up for the change in days. Instead, Mr. Younger turned up at the open evening with local police after he or one of his friends had reported Dr. Georgelus for neglectful supervision and physical abuse, pointing to the fact that Luna was dressed as a girl as evidence of both. Mr. Younger also brought a number of his personal friends with cameras to record the incident, seemingly hoping to capture the moment the police put his wife in handcuffs and dragged her off in a patrol car so he could then post it online as proof that she was a bad mother. That didn't happen, thankfully. Dr. Georgilus is a white upper-class woman, meaning she is low on the list of people likely to be targeted with police violence and was thus spared it in this instance. The police assessed the situation, asked a few people attending the event some questions, and then left after concluding that Luna was in no immediate danger from her mother. Furious at the turn of events, Mr. Younger stormed off, leaving both of his children behind. That's when CPS took notice of him and began investigating both parents, Dr. Georgilus on the basis of the anonymous tip and Mr. Younger on the basis of his actions. Dr. Georgilus was ultimately cleared, whilst Mr. Younger was found to be engaging in abusive behaviour towards his children and former spouse. This is at least part of the reason why, in October of 2019, 11 out of 12 Texan jurors strongly recommended that Dr. Ann Georgilus receive sole custody and conservatorship of not just Luna, but Luna's twin brother, Jude. Again, these were Mr. Younger's peers, red-blooded Texans, the very people Mr. Younger claims to support him. Yet, when evidence of the case is shown in the court of law, reliant on expert testimony instead of Mr. Younger's hearsay, the people of Texas overwhelmingly come out in support of Luna's mother. Sadly, the judge ruled to ignore the jury, and the father has continued to exploit the court of public opinion and the fact that Dr. Georgilus is trying to protect Luna's privacy. Because the act of staging a public commotion, barging into a children's event with police and a number of complete strangers, cameras rolling, throwing around accusations of child abuse with absolutely zero merit, is fucking monstrous. And it's had a marked impact upon Luna, with the CPS report stating that
Luna states she feels safe at home. Luna states she's sometimes afraid of her dad because he's once called the cops on her mum during open house at school. Luna states this scares the kids. Luna states her dad called the police because he didn't want her to be at open house with her mum and he wanted his time. Luna states this happened yesterday and the police didn't do anything. Luna states the police has never come to her house before. Luna states she's also afraid of her dad because he doesn't let her dress in girl clothes because he thinks it's all about your body and it's not. Luna states her mum let her dress how she wants to dress. Luna states she feels comfortable in girls' clothes.
Again, Mr. Younger later confirmed to police that he had intended to force Luna to dress as a boy, an admission he made whilst claiming like Dr. Georgilus had made an unreasonable call to change the night he had custody of Luna for Luna's safety. It's also worth noting that Mr. Younger has a history of physical violence targeting Luna. Back in 2018, when things first came to an impasse, Dr. Georgilus requested the court appoint an amicus attorney, an unbiased third party to decide what was reasonable for Luna, part of which were restrictions placed on Luna's physical appearance, including her hair. The exact wording of the order was, quote, "Parties must obtain permission of the amicus attorney and follow the instructions of the amicus attorney regarding haircuts for the child." End quote. A copy of said order was attached in a later petition filed by Dr. Georgilus after Mr. Young had violated it, cutting Luna's hair short while she was under his care. As the petition reads,
in response to Luna's choices, the father has engaged in increasingly aggressive behavior, including physical force, toward the mother. His actions are clearly intended to threaten and intimidate the mother. Further, the father has engaged in emotionally abusive behavior toward the child, as example only, haircutting and other non-affirming actions. Although unclear if this behavior rises to the level of family violence at this time, the father's aggression is becoming more common and more intense.
In spite of having both Luna and Jude with him, the father only cut Luna's hair. In fact, Jude is pretty upset that Mr. Younger expects his mum to cut his hair, yet paid for someone to cut Luna's, clearly not understanding what was actually being done to his sister. Said haircut was an act meant to publicly shame Luna for who she is, a way for Mr. Younger to assert control over not just her body, but her expression. Because whilst we might be tempted to think that it's just a haircut, our hair is one of the earliest ways trans people can express who they are. That's important context to keep in mind since it transforms an otherwise normal thing into something far darker. On one hand, feeding your child is not merely your right as a parent, but your responsibility. Yet, in spite of that, if you force-fed them, literally shoving food down their throat, that would still be child abuse due to that context and the harm said actions resulted in. Well, the very same thing is true here. It's also important to note the clear impact this whole ordeal has had on Luna, a fact revealed at the hearing relating to this petition. During a video call in which Dr. Georgilus was working in the background, Mr. Younger began bullying his daughter about said haircut, resulting in her freezing like a deer in the headlights of an oncoming car. After an extended silence, Luna finally replied, telling Mr. Younger that she was going, at which point Dr. Georgilus took the phone and hung up. Of course, Mr. Younger lied about the order during his hearing, trying to weasel his way out of the fact that he directly violated it when being examined by Ms. Meaders.
You violated the order, didn't you?
No, ma'am.
Okay, the order says you have to get permission from the amicus before you cut your child's hair.
It doesn't say that.
Okay, if the court says you have to get permission from the amicus before cutting the child's hair, then you did violate the order.
I can't speculate on something that's not true.
Okay, you didn't get his permission, did you?
I did not.
You didn't even ask?
I did not. Thankfully, the judge called Mr. Younger out on his bullshit, giving the following warning.
First of all, you do have to get permission of the amicus attorney to cut the child's hair. That's verbatim in the order. That's a violation of the order for you to cut the child's hair without the permission of the amicus attorney. Don't do it again.
Thing is, the abusive behaviour has only continued, with Mr. Younger still trying to force the conclusion he wants, the only conclusion he'll ever accept, physically intimidating Luna in order to try and get it.
Right. So I got visitation for 1 month in July, and I scheduled 2 appointments with her during that time. And during those appointments, 4 times during those 2 appointments, my son told her that he wants to be a boy all the time, and most importantly, he wants to go to school this year as a boy. She did not respond to him. She did not write anything down. She did not take notes. She gave him no feedback at all that she had even heard him, and she just moved on and ignored him.
Gone is the pretense that it's Luna's mother whose presence is impacting her answers. Mr. Younger is just straight up gloating about the fact that his daughter doesn't dare disagree with him when he's around, in spite of the fact that Luna was very clear that she is a girl when neither parent is around. But somehow, it continues to get worse.
So he came to me and he has an Apple Watch. He came to me and he says, well, I want to record myself telling her that I want to be a boy so I can come show you that I have done that. Like I'm telling people. And I said, okay, that's your prerogative. I mean, in Texas, it's a 1-party recording state and you can go record. And I told him not to hide anything and to be open about it. And he went in there and did that. And she completely freaked out over that. And I think what she freaked out over, she's afraid that other sessions were recorded.
Right.
And so she said that the children were very afraid of disobeying me for making that recording. And she called CPS and made a report on me. And on that basis, they took my kids away.
Let's just be clear. Luna did not approach Mr. Younger with the suggestion of recording said therapy. Mr. Younger forced her to do it. Dr. Fletcher's reaction is not due to the fact that she was being recorded, but the degree of manipulation and control Mr. Younger is displaying, forcing Luna to prove that she told her therapist everything he ordered her to tell them, even when he's not around. It reminds me of when domestic abusers track their victims' phones or remove all the doors in the house. Mr. Younger is displaying all the hallmarks of domestic abusers, and yet he can't help but paint himself as the victim of some vast conspiracy.
The psychologist, Dr. Susan Fletcher, fabricates this abuse story just because my kids say that they're afraid of disobeying me. And next thing you know, I don't have my kids anymore. It was all done by the counselors in cahoots with the judge. That's how they got me.
Except this assertion, this idea that the counselors are in cahoots with the judge, ignores not only the fact that one of said judges overruled a jury of Mr. Younger's own peers in his favour, but the fact that Luna has had no less than 4 separate assessments, all of which agree with one another. But that's why he only ever names the most recent therapist, acting as if they're Luna's first and only therapist. Because once you know the truth, his lies crumble into nothing. Yet what's even more telling is how, apparently, it's not just the therapists who are in on the whole thing, it's also Dr. Georgelus's teenage daughters.
So my son's going into these timeouts. When I start pushing back on that, she starts taking the girls out, and they have like these secret meetings that would last like 4 or 5 hours. And they'd come back and just do very strange things. Like one time they came home and just surrounded the boys and wouldn't let me touch the boys or be with the boys. Very strange. And then eventually she filed for divorce and forced me out of the house, saying that I was psychologically bad for her daughters. And her daughters said they were depressed when I was in the house. So,
if you have any experience with the Christian right in the US, what Mr. Younger is saying is likely setting off all sorts of alarms. The whole backroom meeting between girls relating to whether or not a child is LGBT+, shares all the hallmarks of your typical Christian panic, like the 1980s Satanic Panic. Indeed, a lot of the conspiracies relating to trans people are grounded in white Christian fascism, this idea that society is being degraded by a Jewish shadow state pushing for equality, and the only way to fix things is to resort to violent ultranationalism. I really cannot overstate just how terrifying this entire thing is. People are going to die if Mr. Younger is allowed to continue lying as he is. And if you think I'm exaggerating here, if you think I'm being hyperbolic, consider the following things Mr. Younger chose to state publicly, knowing full well that the entire thing was being recorded.
We are reaching a point where the family courts have become so abusive that in some of the rural counties that I've spoken in, there's open talk of judicial assassinations. There's open talk of outright insurrection. There's been cases where I've had sheriffs tell people, calm down, this isn't the right time for that. I mean, you're talking about stealing people's kids on an industrial scale. And if you keep doing that, you're going to have massive social unrest. That's why I love the background that you've got here. It's very appropriate because that's exactly where we're headed. It's an incredibly corrupt system. And it can't last much longer. It's just gotten to the point where it's so bad and it has ruined so many men's lives. Dude, it's gonna make BLM, look like a Boy Scout rally. Your first recourse always in dealing with a problem is the letterbox. Send somebody a letter, explain the problem, and try to work it out. If that doesn't work, you've got the ballot box. You can try to pass a law that changes things to so that you think that they're right. If that doesn't work, you can always go to the jury box, right? You can have your citizens adjudicate a case, and if you're right, you'll win. If that doesn't work, all that's left is the cartridge box.
Now, we will be back to break this down in detail in a follow-up video, but I hope I've not only showed you just how much Jeff Younger has lied, but also how dangerous his lies are. Mr. Younger is not only a danger towards his daughter and his ex-wife, but everyone living in Texas and even the rest of the US. His lies are being used to fuel the fires of fascism on US soil. The fact that he felt comfortable in stating this shortly before he began running for office is telling of just how bad things are right now, politically. And it's my hope that the people of Texas House District 63, Denton County, catch on to the snake oil he's selling them and the blood price attached. Because Mr. Younger is not simply unfit as a father, he's unfit for office. And this is where I put out a call to action, since on the 1st of March, half a month away, Texas will be having its primaries, meaning that Mr. Younger will be up against 3 other Republicans for the ballot spot in the 2022 general election that will be taking place on the 8th of November. Now, I don't know if he's likely to get the spot. All I do know is that this man's lies have had such power to make it overseas. So, considering that, I don't think it's a risk we can all ignore. Mr. Younger may very well be the person Dr. Denise Wooten, the Democratic candidate, will be running against. Trust me, I could not get over the irony of the fact that Mr. Younger could potentially be running against a certified psychologist with over 30 years of experience. However, if that is the case, you need to be ready to counter this. Jeff Younger has attempted to build a platform under the false pretense that he stands for family, relying on the queerphobic idea that LGBT+ identities are anti-family. Well, I say we beat him at his own game. Run headlines broadcasting the fact that 11 out of 12 Texan jurors ruled Mr. Younger to be unfit as a father at best. Talk about how, in spite of him attempting to weaponize Child Protective Services against his ex-wife, it was him who was found to be abusive. Attack the fact that this man promised to tell the truth on the Bible in Texas and then bore false witness repeatedly and is now threatening his fellow citizens because they did not believe in his lies. Because if this man is given any form of office, anything that legitimizes the bullshit he is selling, the whole trans hysteria in the US is going to be kicked into overdrive. After all, this man has made himself the poster child for the myth of trans indoctrination. So it's up to us to pull back the curtain and expose the fraud behind this entire show. Because we have to. We have no other choice. Again, we will be returning to Mr. Younger to refute the bullshit he spread in the stream, but for now, be on alert. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gerrit Van Voorst, Cthulhu, Higgins the Seagull, and Flynn. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.